would, open up to Genesis chapter 31. Genesis chapter 31. If you look at the last verse of chapter 30, just to kind of keep in mind where we've been, that Jacob's already worked 7 years for Leah, 7 years for Rachel. Of course, the trickery that took place there between. And then he was ready to leave and go home. Laban said, "Stay here. I know I've been blessed because you're here." He says, "Just name your wages." And Jacob's about 91 years old at that point. And so you just name your wages. And so sure enough, he did, and they've been changed over and over again. We'll see that as we go through chapter 31. And also to notice that Jacob is transforming over the course of this time. As we continue through these 6 years, after he's worked off 7 years for each of his first two wives, in terms of Leah and Rachel at least. And so verse 43 of chapter 30 says, "So the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys." And you realize the Lord is the one who's bringing all these things together. You see, as Jacob's heart is changing in terms of resolve and integrity and faith, you see how the Lord responds to that, to take care of him, even though he's still within working for his father-in-law, Laban. Then, chapter 31 opens this way. "Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, 'Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what belonged to our father he has made all this wealth.'" The first thing you learn is, Leah and Rachel have brothers. But you notice it here, they start to look at this and say, "You know what? You see what Jacob's doing? He's taking our inheritance. He's taking the wealth that should be our father's, and now it's being his." And what's really motivating them in this picture? Greed, jealousy, those kind of things. And so notice the next thing here. It says in verse 31, he says, "Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons." If you've ever worked in an office environment where there's, more than just a handful of people, sometimes you can be around the corner and you can hear people say things about you. Sometimes the things they say are not too kind, and sometimes they're not too helpful. Sometimes they're honest, and we just need to hear them. But here's a situation where Jacob's doing things according to what's good now, and yet he's being seen with a jealous eye from Laban's sons. And you see their greed. Verse 2, "Jacob saw the attitude of Laban, and behold, it was not friendly toward him as formerly." Jacob's starting to see a change in his father-in-law. He used to be really kind to me, used to really love me. You think, some 6 years ago, he begged me to stay. He said, "Name your wages," and now he is not happy with me. And to realize, is that because Jacob's wrongdoing? No. And you realize, sometimes you can do the right things and people still won't like you. And we need to understand when those moments happen, it is a time to examine ourselves and go, do they not like me because of something I'm doing wrong? And to really think about that and make sure that we're doing things according to the right path. But then to turn and go, if you are doing things according to Christ and people don't like you, just resign that you're blessed. That's exactly what Jesus said about, you're blessed if you're persecuted for my name's sake, for doing what's righteous. He says there's a blessing that endures there, because it means you're going to persevere to do what's right, even when met with opposition, even if people hate you for it. And you go, here's Jacob. He sees this attitude of Laban that's changing, and you might even have a footnote for attitude that says his face. And sometimes just seeing someone, you can tell that they don't feel so well about you by the way that they look or they don't look at you. And to realize, here he is. Then, look at verse 3. "Then the Lord, the covenant God, said to Jacob, 'Return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you.'" Notice how the covenant God now speaks to Jacob to say, all right, it's time to go home. Now, remember, Jacob wanted to go home 6 years earlier, but he allowed himself to be persuaded to stay around. And now here's the Lord saying, it's time to go. And this should bring us echoes from the days of Abram. It's time for you to leave Ur of the Chaldees, and it's time for you to go where I show you this land. And realize, okay, this is going to take faith. And so here he is. And notice the other aspect of this. Return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. What do you see God saying? You stay here, it's not going to be the same. I'm telling you the direction to go. Then, notice how it continues. The Lord said this to Jacob in some way. It doesn't tell us exactly. And as a result of this, look at verse 4. And really, this narration, verses 4 through 13, is all one conversation. So just kind of mark that in your mind. But, verse 4. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to his flock in the field. So he calls these two wives. Now, why he doesn't call Bilhah and Zilpah, I don't know. But he calls Leah and Rachel out to his flock, which is kind of curious because it tells you that they're not working the flocks anymore. If you remember, this is how Jacob met Rachel, as she was bringing the sheep out to be watered. But apparently that's not going on so much anymore. Calls them out to the flock, verse 5. And said to them, I see your father's attitude, that it is not friendly toward me as formerly, but the God of my father has been with me. He says, I can see it. It's almost as if he's saying, can you see it too? Can you tell that it's not the same as what it was? He's not so excited for me to still be here anymore. And I sure know your brother's not excited that I'm here. Then, if you notice the end of verse 5, tells you what Jacob is really learning and discovering through all of these different things. He's going to explain why he thinks this way. But I want you to notice at the end of verse 5, he says, but the Lord of my father has been with me. You notice that he still hasn't said, my God? He says, this is the God of my father, talking about Isaac. And so he makes this statement, God has been with me. And he's going to explain how he knows this here in a little bit. But here's something I want you to really consider as we go through the rest of these verses tonight. Hold your place here in Genesis 31. We're going to come back. Look over at 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. And look down at verse 18. First Peter chapter 2, verse 18. Peter says, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. And really the idea behind unreasonable is even crooked. So you notice Peter's instruction. He says, you know what, here you are, a servant, working for a master. He says, you be submissive to them, and specifically with all respect. You show them respect. And it's not necessarily show them respect if they deserve it. It's show them respect even if they don't deserve it. Then he goes on, he says, and I'm not talking about this line in the sand that's just if they're good and gentle. He says, even if they're unreasonable, even if they're crooked. Now, we hear statements like that, and we sometimes want to recoil and go, well, surely he doesn't mean that if somebody's going to go around and not treat you well, that you should be allowed to just run off. But I want you to see something tonight as we go through Genesis 31. So often we miss out on seeing the favor of God because we don't walk according to God. When you don't submit yourselves in these situations, you don't get to see God's hand at work because you never step out by faith to do it his way. And if you notice something else, verse 19, he says, for this finds favor. In other words, it finds grace before God. If for the sake of conscience toward God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. And now all of a sudden, you find yourself underneath someone who's crooked or unreasonable, and you're suffering for it unjustly because you're doing what's right. You're treating them good. You're honoring them, showing them respect. And he says, you know what? This finds favor with God because you're doing it not because it's what you want to do. You're doing it because out of a good conscience toward God, this is what I'll do. Then, verse 20, he says, for what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? He says, now, there are things you can bring on yourself. And don't act like it's somebody else's problem or somebody else's fault. But then he flips it around in verse 20. He says, but if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. God goes, that reminds me of my son. He was willing to submit and do what was right, even at the highest stakes and the highest price. He says, this finds favor with God. Now, remember these principles, because has God changed? No, he has not. Now, the covenants have changed, but God has not changed. Now, come back to Genesis 31. So now you're going to see, how does God deal with a servant like Jacob, who's serving his father-in-law and has done so now for 20 years. 2 decades. And even just 6 years before, he wanted him to be there so bad, but now here 6 years later, his attitude toward Jacob has completely changed. So, now look at Genesis 31, verse 6. Jacob knows that it's because of the God of his father has been with him. Verse 6, you know that I have served your father with all my strength. Who knows better about what a husband is doing than his own wife, or in this situation, his own wives? So, to go, you know how hard I've served your father. They got a front row seat for that. They knew how many nights he didn't get to come home because he was out in the field taking care of predators, taking care of the sheep, making sure they were taken care of, all those things together. He says, you know how I've done this. He's done it with integrity. We'll see that explained a little bit more. Verse 7. Yet your father has cheated me. How's that for a crook? He says, has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. However, God did not allow him to hurt me. He says, I've been cheated, and yet I still gave my all. I gave him everything I had to offer, all my strength. He says, whenever all of a sudden my things would take off, which were going to be my wages, he'd switch it and change it. And then he would be at an advantage, and I would be in a disadvantage. But notice what he points out. What does he know God has done through this process? He has not allowed me to get hurt. And you think in terms of the way Laban has treated me, the way Laban's sons have been talking about him, perhaps even predators out in the field in terms of keeping his flock or his sheep or his goats, whatever the cattle may be, then notice how it continues. Do you see how Jacob's starting to become really spiritually minded through these things? If you think back at the end of verse 5, but the God of my father has been with me. Verse 7, however, God did not allow him to hurt me. Verse 8, if he spoke thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flock brought forth speckled. And if he spoke thus, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock brought forth striped. Do you see how he's not talking about, well, it's because we peeled those little sticks of poplar and those little sticks of other types of wood. You notice he's not saying that? Who does he recognize has brought this about? God has. How many times whenever we go through something, we start to go after some things that are really on the edge and really not straightforward about what God really wants, and then all of a sudden we start with this realization of, those things don't matter. This is what God's doing. He's the one who's making this happen. And he starts to go through what he's talking about. He says, you know what, all of a sudden there weren't very many speckled, and then Laban says, how about the speckled become your wages? And then all of a sudden, look at all these speckled sheep. And then they go, well, what about the striped ones? You know, we'll just make the ones that are striped your wages now, since there aren't so many of those anymore. And then all of a sudden, look at all these striped sheep that come. No wonder Laban could figure out whose hand this is coming at. Wouldn't that be something? Just whenever you flip the script on somebody to see how God uses it to their advantage and not yours. Do we recognize how much control God has? Sometimes it seems we forget that. That even whenever someone's being mistreated like Jacob is in this story, to watch God's hand at work in protecting him, in blessing him, so many times we get protected from things we never knew we were even in danger of. But notice how it continues on. Verse 9. once again, look at who he's staring at. Thus God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me. What does Jacob recognize? The source. Look at what God has done. And you see this and go, Jacob doesn't take him by stealing. He doesn't take him by some kind of deceitful way. He says, look at what God's done. He says Laban would change the wages, and then God would change what kind of fur and coats these animals had. Amazing. Then, notice how it continues. Verse 10. And it came about at the time when the flock were mating that I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream. Notice how God has been communicating with Jacob through this process. And notice what happens. He says, saw in a dream, and behold, the male goats which were mating were striped, speckled, and mottled. And if you don't know what mottled is, it's kind of like a spots, or looks like almost if you took a paint smear and put it on the side of the animal. But he says, I saw what was going on. It didn't matter. God's in control. Then, verse 11. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream. Well, how did God communicate? Dreams. And to think in terms, you might be thinking about Hebrews chapter 1. But to see the aspects of this, to go, then the angel of God said to me in the dream. Do you remember what Jacob had a dream about back in little old town of Bethel? About angels ascending and descending a ladder that go up to heaven. You know, all of a sudden, here's God saying, I'm going to communicate with you. Here's my messenger. Isn't that what angel means? Messenger. Messenger of God. And he said to me, Jacob. And I said, here I am. Verse 12. He said, lift up now your eyes and see that all the male goats which are mating are striped, speckled, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. Is God aware? Is he aware of what's going on? Should we ever be a people who are faithful toward God, who say, does God know what's going on in my life? Look at, I'm being taken advantage of. They change my wages every time it works to their advantage. How come he could let me go through all this? He knows. The question is, do we know enough to serve him and go, you know what, if my master takes advantage of these things, I'm going to respect him. And I'm going to serve him. And I'm going to serve him well because out of conscience for Christ. Now, we know that Jacob wasn't thinking about Christ necessarily, but he's thinking about God. And if you notice it here, he says, here's the communication from God telling him that through this angel in this dream. He says, I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. It's as if he could say, I know exactly every time they've changed. You want me to give you the dates? Then, verse 13, I am the God of Bethel. Remember me? He says, where you anointed a pillar. Remember what he anointed it with? Oil, rejoicing, gladness. He says, where you made a vow to me. He says, do you remember your vow? Now, look back at chapter 28 and look just so you can be reminded of the vow. Genesis 28. Then look at verse 20. This is after he had woken up and he pours oil on the stone, names the place Bethel. Verse 20. Then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. Has God taken care of him so far? Where is God now telling him to go? Go back home. And he says, remember what your vow was. If I bring you back safely home, what kind of relationship do we have? You're my worshiper and I'm your God. You're my servant and I'm your God. Personal relationship. Now, come back over to Genesis 31. So that was his vow. Does God remember his vow? Yes. Now, think about it. How long ago had that been? 20 years. You make a vow before God. Is he waiting for you to come through? Is he expecting you to keep your word of this vow that you made to God? He says, remember, he says, well, you made that vow to me. He says, now arise, back in chapter 31, verse 13. Now arise, leave this land and return to the land of your birth. He says, time to go home. Now, there's the conversation, or the monologue, for Jacob speaking to Rachel and Leah. Notice what he does next, verse 14. What do they think about all this? Remember, this is their father. This is their homeland. They haven't left this place before in anything that's written down for us. Verse 14. Rachel and Leah said to him, talking about to Jacob, do we still have any portion or inheritance in our father's house? What are they concerned about? Money, wealth, livestock. It says, nothing physical left here for us. We don't have anything here. Then verse 15, look at how bad the relationship has become. Are we not reckoned by him as foreigners? How well is Laban at maintaining these relationships with his daughters? It says, we might as well be foreigners. We're not accepted. We're not treated well. He says, for he has sold us. Remember what the price was? 7 years of labor. And just so happens Jacob's the one who paid it twice. Then, he says, he sold us and has also entirely consumed our purchase price. And everything that you did for him, it's already all used up. What's in that for us? Verse 16, surely all the wealth which God has taken away from our father belongs to us and our children. Now then, do whatever God has said to you. Now, I know at the end of verse 16 it sounds like, that's a great attitude to have. Whatever God has said, go do it. But I'm going to tell you something. It comes from the wrong motives. Because what helps them make up their mind about what they should do? He says, look, Dad treats us like foreigners. There's nothing that he has that he could give us because it's already been translated and taken over to you. He says, and everything that you would have, he says, that's ours and our children's. He says, so we're okay with whatever your God tells you to do. You think that's really the best motive to do things with? I mean, do you ever go, you know what, everything's just gone terrible. I guess I should finally try to just do something that God says. That's not the best motive, but it's the right thing to do, isn't it? To do what God commands. And so you realize, here's God looking at heart. Verse 17. Then Jacob arose and put his children and his wives upon camels. Now, keep in mind, he got 4 wives and 12 children we know by name, including that one daughter, Dinah, who counts as one of those 12. So there's 16, plus himself is 17. And if you remember back at the tail end of chapter 30, it says he had female and male servants. So let's just say there's at least 3 or 4 of those. So this is a group of more than 20 people. And it just so happens that 12 of them are under the age of 14. How easy is it to travel with young children? Especially if you're on camels. Now, he says, Jacob arose, put his children and his wives upon camels, verse 18, and he drove away all his livestock. Now think about that. He drove away all of his livestock and all his property which he had gathered, his acquired livestock which he had gathered in Paddan Aram. And Paddan Aram is the region that Haran sits in. He says, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. He says, all right. We would say if it was maybe 150 years ago, it's time for a cattle drive. We're going to take all these animals and livestock, and we're going to head down south about roughly 400 miles or so, plus or minus. And so here they take out. But there's one more thing that Rachel wants before she leaves home. Verse 19. When Laban had gone to shear his flock, so Laban's not necessarily at his home tent. He's out taking care of this flock. And if you remember from the previous chapter, there's about a 3 days journey between where Jacob keeps his flock and Laban's flock is. It says, he's out shearing his flock while he's distracted working. Then Rachel stole the household idols that were her father's. There's one thing she's not going to leave without. Her father treats her like a foreigner, and she decides, you know what? I need to take these household gods. Now, if you're thinking of some massive statue that's like 6 feet tall, you have the wrong image. Because you'll see later on, she could even sit on this thing and it'd be hidden. But I want you to take kind of special note about this aspect. Hold your place here, we'll come back. Look over at Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7. And look at verse 41. Now keep in mind about the book of Genesis. Who are really the first listeners to Genesis? The Israelites. And what's the setting? They're in the wilderness, right? So here they are in the wilderness. They're listening to these things that Moses is writing down from Genesis. They already have this new covenant, this old covenant, new to them. And here they are. And all of a sudden you get this story about Rachel and taking these household idols. And I want you to see what the state of Israel is, even in the wilderness. Acts chapter 7, Stephen speaking to the Sanhedrin. Look down at verse 41. It says, at that time they made a calf, talking about the Israelites in the wilderness, and brought a sacrifice to the idol and were rejoicing in the works of their hands. How were God's people doing? Idol worshipers. And you go, let's see, how many of the commandments could they break at once? But it just so happens those 10 commandments had not yet been given to them. So, but notice what else, verse 42. But God turned away and delivered them up to serve the host of heaven. Not him. They're serving the host of heaven. As it is written in the book of the prophets, and that prophet is the prophet by the name of Amos. He says, it was not to me that you offered victims and sacrifices 40 years in the wilderness, was it, O house of Israel? He says, you remember all that idol worship you had? You even brought it out into the wilderness with you. And if you want a little bit more detail, verse 43. You also took along the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of the god Rompha, the images which you made to worship. I also will remove you beyond Babylon. Now think about that. God's people who had been delivered out of Egypt into the wilderness were bringing along their idols with them. And all of a sudden, here they are listening to these stories of Genesis about their own ancestors. And all of a sudden, here comes this story about the favored wife, Rachel, and yet she can't leave her father's house until she's stolen his idols. Well, I wonder if there's a lesson here that God's trying to teach his people about those that worship idols. Now, if you already know the outcome for Rachel, then I think you already understand a little bit here. Yes, Christina.
I was just wondering, do you think they knew that they were idol worshipers? Do you think that they knew that...
The Israelites, you mean?
That those were idols?
Oh, yeah. But I'll tell you when they must have discovered it. Whenever they make this covenant with God, and it talks about that Moses read Exodus 20, 21, 22, and 23 in their hearing, and they said, all the Lord has said we will do, and we will be obedient. And they become part of this old covenant to us, new to them. And at that point, the very beginning of that is Exodus chapter 20, which talks about you shall have no graven images, you shall not bow down to them, you shall not put anything before them. And so at that point, there would have to be some awareness of those things, if that makes sense.
Yes, of course. I'm just wondering, I've never known anyone, and I've never said myself I'm an idol worshiper. I wonder if maybe they thought it was just some really neat relic that they wanted.
Right. Kind of even just the name of it goes together with going, yeah. in terms of those things.
We just have to be careful because we can call things special that could.
That's right. That's for sure. We can put all kinds of idols up in front, even if they're not some graven image. Definitely so. So you see what's going on here in the midst of the days, whenever the people who would be the first audience of Genesis would all of a sudden see someone in this story, and you might go, why bring up this little detail? Well, it goes on even from there. If you remember Joshua 24, after they've taken over the promised land, after God has done exactly what he promised to do, to give them this land flowing with milk and honey, and then Joshua's kind of last statement to them is, do not go back to idols. And remember his statement is, choose today who you're going to serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, the covenant God. So you start to see where that is. Now keep in mind, the end of Joshua is some 47 years away from Egypt, maybe 50. But going, here the people were in the wilderness. God was going to transform them in the midst of there. And remember how many of them he laid low? All the men who were over the age of 20 when they left Egypt. So he's making a point in those 40 years. Now come back to Genesis 31. So Rachel stole the household idols that were her father's. Then verse 20. And Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he was fleeing. Now, it says deceived. Well, we know how God stands about deception. Anybody got a footnote, though, for where it says deceived? What does it say? Stole their heart. He says, he has stole my heart. Now, here's this aspect. Jacob stole the heart of Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he was leaving. All right, I'm going to play upon the thoughts of grandparents. If you can imagine, all right, this may be a stretch for some, but maybe not for others. If you can imagine you live in the same place as your two daughters, you have seen all these grandchildren be born. You have 12 grandchildren that are given by name. So 11 sons, Dinah, we know there were other daughters at some point. But going, they have been with you since the day they were born. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, they all leave. Jacob leaves, his 4 wives, his 12 children. They get up on the camels, they head south, and here you are, you're out shearing sheep, and then you come back home and they're all gone. How would your heart feel about that? Would you feel like somebody stole your heart? Now, just know that whenever you see this word deceived, don't think it in terms of he lied to them. That's not what it's talking about. This is about he stole their hearts. And you'll see this same phrase show up 3 different times through chapter 31. So you notice what's in place here. Then it brings up the next aspect in verse 21. It says, so he fled with all that he had. Well, if you remember back to verse 43 of chapter 30, that's the all he's talking about. Camels, male, female servants, donkeys, large flocks, 4 wives, 12 children, himself. This is a pretty big caravan, isn't it? It's like, it's kind of hard to sneak away, right? Then, verse 21, he says, so he fled with all that he had, and he arose and crossed the Euphrates River and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. Now, if you remember where Paddan Aram is, it's on the north side of the Euphrates River, where Haran was, where Laban lived, and where Leah and Rachel were from. So whenever you see this picture, you imagine taking that big old group across the Euphrates River. And it's not as if they go, hey, we'll just take the ferry across. Taking this humongous family and group across, and then once you cross over the Euphrates, it's not as if you're almost there. You still have over 150 miles to go. And where he's going to end up in the next part of this chapter is going to be about 280 miles away from where they started. And so you see where it comes to this point, and now they're going to head for the hill country of Gilead. If you know where Gilead is, fantastic. If you don't, Gilead is on the east side of the Jordan River, kind of southeast of the Sea of Galilee. But it's up in the mountainous regions. I don't know how you feel about taking care of livestock and flocks and sheep, but all of a sudden trying to drive them over hilly ground, this is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. And along with, you're traveling with 12 children who were probably 13 years of age or younger. You go, this is not going to go fast. But you're going to see as it moves on next week to go, they have a 3 days head start. And then to go, and what's going to happen next? Well, just hang on and keep on reading. Because next week we'll come back and we'll pick up right here in verse 22. All right. Have a good one.